He spent his nights tangled in the sheets with his young, tight-skinned girlfriend while I lay awake in our marital bed, staring at the ceiling, drowning in humiliation. He thought I'd cry. He thought I'd beg. He thought I'd accept it like a weak, desperate wife clinging to a crumbling marriage. But he forgot one thing. I wasn't just a woman scorned. I was a woman ready to burn his entire world to the ground. Marcus thought he had won. He thought he had the upper hand. He thought he could humiliate me, walk away untouched, and start his shiny new life with his plaything. Oh, sweetheart, he had no idea what was coming. My name is Evelyn Sinclair, and I'm 44 years old. For 2 decades, I was the devoted, ever-supportive wife of Marcus Sinclair, a man who built his fortune with my help but conveniently forgot my name the moment a fresh, young body entered his life. I met him when I was just 24, young, ambitious, and madly in love with a man who knew exactly how to make a woman feel special. He was magnetic, dominant, and dangerously smooth. For years, I played the perfect wife. I took care of our home, hosted the most elegant parties, supported his career, and stood by him through every storm. I loved him with every fiber of my being. But love doesn't mean a damn thing when you're married to a man like Marcus. The signs were there, the late nights, the whispered phone calls, the sudden interest in grooming. But the final blow came when I followed him one night. There he was, sitting in a dimly lit restaurant, his hand grazing the soft, bare thigh of a woman who looked young enough to be my daughter. She leaned into him, giggling, her red lips inches from his ear. He wasn't just cheating, he was flaunting it. Something inside me snapped. I watched from the shadows, my fingers curling into fists as he kissed her, his hand sliding up her dress like he had no wife, no history, no soul. Rage coursed through my veins like liquid fire, but I didn't cry. Oh no. I simply pulled out my phone, snapped a few pictures, and walked away. Marcus Sinclair wanted a new life? I was going to make sure it was a living hell. The next morning, I greeted him with the sweetest smile I could muster. He walked in, looking smug and satisfied, barely giving me a glance as he loosened his tie. I was cooking breakfast, humming to myself as if I wasn't plotting his destruction. "Good morning, darling," I purred, setting his coffee down in front of him. He barely acknowledged me, scrolling through his phone, probably texting her. I leaned down, trailing my fingers over his shoulder, whispering, "Late night at work again?" His fingers tightened around his coffee mug. "Yeah, big project. Liar." I wanted to scream it in his face, but I just smiled, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek, inhaling the faint scent of a woman's perfume that didn't belong to me. Oh, Marcus, you have no idea what's coming. That day, I emptied our joint bank account, every single dollar. I transferred it to an offshore account, one he didn't even know existed. Marcus thought he was the mastermind of our finances, but he underestimated me. I had been quietly stashing money away for years, in case of an emergency. And what was a bigger emergency than this? By the time he would realize, it would be too late. And that was just the beginning. Marcus thrived on his image. He wasn't just some corporate businessman. He was a public figure, a man whose reputation was everything. So I made sure that reputation burned. The pictures I took, I leaked them anonymously. To his business partners, his board members, even the local gossip sites. It wasn't just a scandal. It was a wildfire. The moment he walked into his office, he was met with judgmental stares, whispered conversations behind his back. His phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from reporters, friends, colleagues. And the best part? I acted completely oblivious. When he stormed into the house that evening, slamming the door behind him, his face red with fury, I simply looked up from my book. "Rough day?" I asked sweetly, and "You—" He stopped himself, clenching his jaw, veins popping at his temple. He couldn't accuse me, he had no proof, and I just smiled. "Sweetheart, this is only the beginning. The morning after his world started crumbling, Marcus woke up looking exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, tension lines creasing his forehead, and that unmistakable look of a man who had just realized his perfect little fantasy was slipping through his fingers. He didn't say much over breakfast. He barely touched his coffee, barely acknowledged me, his mind clearly preoccupied. I could tell he was putting the pieces together, trying to figure out how those scandalous pictures had gotten out. He was convinced it was a setup, but by who? His mistress? A jealous colleague? He wouldn't dare suspect me. Not yet. And that was perfect, because I wasn't done. Not even close. I decided to keep the pressure on, slowly turning the screws. I started with small, almost unnoticeable things, just enough to make him uneasy. I went shopping and left an absurd number of receipts lying around the house: expensive designer bags, jewelry, lavish skincare, things I had no intention of ever using. I let him find them, stacked neatly on the kitchen counter, the total amounts adding up to a sickening sum. He frowned as he stared at them one evening, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice tight. "Oh," I said with an innocent blink. "Just a little retail therapy. You don't mind, do you, darling? After all, we can afford it." He didn't answer. He just picked up the receipts, stared at them for a long moment, then crumpled them in his fist. I almost laughed. He wanted to confront me, but how could he? He couldn't claim I was wasting our money, not when he had been spending God knows how much on his mistress, and he still hadn't realized that our bank account was empty. Yet. That moment came a few days later, in the middle of the night. I woke up to the sound of the closet door slamming, followed by drawers being yanked open and shut in rapid succession. The bedside lamp clicked on, and I turned over to find Marcus pacing, his phone clutched in one hand, his laptop open on the dresser. His face was pale. I propped myself up on one elbow, rubbing my eyes like a sleepy, confused wife. "Marcus, what's wrong?" He turned to me, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might snap a tooth. "Where's the money?" I frowned. "What money?" His voice was sharp, panicked. "Don't play dumb with me, Evelyn. The bank accounts, the savings, it's gone." I let a slow, sleepy smile spread across my lips, stretching like a cat. "Oh, that." His nostrils flared. "What did you do?" I sighed dramatically and sat up, folding my hands in my lap. "Well, darling, I figured since you were moving on with your life, I should start fresh too. You know, just in case." His fists clenched. "You stole from me?" "Stole?" I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "Oh, Marcus, you do realize our finances were shared, right? I didn't steal anything, I just moved it." His hands shook. "Where is it?" "Safe," I said simply. His breathing was uneven now. "I swear to God, Evelyn, you put that money back now." I laughed. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The irony of it all. "Oh, Marcus," I sighed. "Now why would I do that?" I could practically see his brain short-circuiting. He was used to being in control. He was used to calling the shots. He was used to women bending, breaking, begging. But I wasn't that woman anymore. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm himself. "All right," he said, voice tight. "You want to play games? Fine. But I have more than enough assets. I'll be fine without that money." I smiled. "We'll see." And oh, we would see. Because I wasn't finished yet. I gave it another 2 weeks, letting the stress simmer, letting the weight of his unraveling life settle in. His company was in crisis mode after the scandal, investors pulling out, business associates keeping their distance. His shiny new relationship wasn't so shiny anymore either. The young mistress wasn't in it for damage control. She had been in it for the power, the luxury, the prestige. And without his clean reputation and unlimited funds, her interest began to fade. Marcus was slipping, and I was about to give him the final shove. I called up a friend, someone who owed me a huge favor, a financial consultant who had been working closely with Marcus's company for years, someone who had access to certain sensitive files. Over coffee, I slid an envelope across the table. "I need you to get this in the right hands," I said. She opened it, eyes scanning the papers inside. Documents, transactions, shady deals Marcus had been involved in over the years. Some of them were very illegal. And now, someone else was going to find out. My friend let out a low whistle. "Damn, Evelyn. You're not just divorcing him. You're burying him." I sipped my coffee with a smile. He buried himself. I'm just making sure the dirt sticks. The scandal hit hard. Financial fraud, tax evasion, corruption charges. It spread like wildfire through the media. His once respected name dragged through the mud. Investors withdrew completely. His company stocks plummeted. And just like that, the great Marcus Sinclair was crumbling. He came home that night looking like a man who had aged 10 years. He was shaking when he poured himself a drink, downing it in one gulp before finally turning to face me. His voice was quiet, desperate. "Evelyn, please, please." I stared at him, really stared at him for the first time in a long time. And you know what I saw? A pathetic man. A weak, foolish man who had gambled away everything and lost. I stood up, walking over to him, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I leaned in close, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. I smiled. "Oh, darling," I whispered, "you haven't even felt pain yet." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there shaking. Because the final blow? Oh, that was coming next. Marcus was unraveling, and it was glorious to watch. His once pristine life was now a minefield of scandals, betrayals, and financial ruin. He tried to contain the fallout, tried to convince himself that he still had control, but the walls were closing in fast. His name, once spoken with admiration in business circles, was now synonymous with disgrace. His mistress had all but disappeared, vanished the moment his money started drying up. His colleagues weren't returning his calls. His lawyer advised him to lay low, which was just another way of saying, "You're screwed." And I wasn't done yet. The night after the scandal broke, he stumbled into the house at nearly 3 a.m., drunk, reeking of whiskey and sweat. He was a shadow of the man he used to be, the powerful, arrogant businessman who once thought himself untouchable. His steps were uneven, his shirt wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't eating. He was losing. I was sitting in the living room when he walked in, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, flipping through a magazine like I didn't have a care in the world. I didn't even look up when he slammed the door shut behind him. "Evelyn." His voice was hoarse, desperate. "We need to talk." I took my time setting my wine glass down, lazily turning a page. "About?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "You know damn well about what. The money, the company, the—" "Jesus, Evelyn, you're destroying me." I finally looked up, meeting his eyes, and I smiled. "Oh, Marcus," I purred, "I'm just getting started." His jaw clenched so hard I thought he might crack a tooth. "I get it, okay? You're angry. You want revenge. You got it. You humiliated me, you took my money, you wrecked my business. What more do you want?" I stood up slowly, walking toward him, letting my silk robe slip just slightly off my shoulder. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make him remember. Enough to let him feel the sting of what he'd lost. I ran a finger down his chest, felt his breath hitch ever so slightly. Good. I wanted him uncomfortable. I wanted him torn between the desire he once had for me and the fear of what I had become. I leaned in, my lips almost touching his ear. "Oh, darling," I whispered, "I haven't even started to make you suffer." I pulled back and turned away before he could react. The next morning, the real fun began. I filed for divorce. But not just any divorce. I went for blood. I demanded everything. The house, the cars, alimony, half of what little was left of his crumbling business. I painted myself as the perfect, devoted wife who had been heartlessly betrayed by a selfish, cheating husband. And thanks to the media storm still surrounding him, the courts were already on my side. But the real dagger? I made sure he knew that I wasn't just taking him for everything, I was taking someone else too. I paid his mistress a visit. She wasn't expecting me, of course. When I arrived at her overpriced little apartment, she opened the door wearing nothing but a silk robe, her long legs peeking out as she gave me a once-over, a smirk forming on her lips. "Wow," she said, arms crossed. "Didn't expect the wife to come knocking." I smiled sweetly. I thought it was time we had a chat. She leaned against the doorway, feigning boredom, but I saw the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. She thought she had won, that I was just a bitter, aging wife trying to get in a few last words. She had no idea I was about to ruin her. "You know," I said, tilting my head, "I'm sure Marcus never mentioned that he's broke, or that the money he was throwing at you wasn't actually his." Her smirk faltered, just a little. I stepped forward, lowering my voice. "And I'm guessing he also never mentioned that I had the power to make sure you never ever get a cent out of him again." Now I had her attention, her arms uncrossed, her expression shifting into something more serious. "What do you want?" I leaned against the doorframe, mirroring her earlier stance. "Simple. Leave, disappear. Block his number, pack your things, and move the hell on. Because if you don't—" I let the sentence hang, reaching into my bag and pulling out a stack of papers. "Let's just say your name might come up in some very unfortunate legal documents. And sweetheart, you don't want that kind of attention." She snatched the papers from my hand, her eyes scanning them. And just like that, the color drained from her face. She knew I wasn't bluffing. Marcus had been using company money, embezzled money, to fund their little love nest. And since she had been so eager to spend it, well, legally speaking, that tied her into the mess. She wasn't just his mistress. She was an accomplice. Her lips parted slightly, panic settling in. "You wouldn't—" I smiled, stepping back. "Try me." The next day, she was gone. Completely vanished. No warning, no goodbye. Just a hollow space where his perfect little dream had once been. Marcus came home that evening, looking like a man on the edge. His phone was glued to his hand, his face red with frustration as he paced back and forth in the living room. "She's not answering," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Her apartment is empty. She just left." I took a sip of my wine, watching him with amusement. "How tragic." His eyes snapped to me. There was something almost animalistic in his gaze, a deep, raw desperation. "You did this." I swirled my wine glass lazily. "You're losing everything, Marcus, piece by piece. And the best part?" I set the glass down, standing up slowly. "I'm the one taking it from you." He stared at me, breathing unevenly, and for the first time since this had all begun, I saw it. Fear. I smiled. "And darling, I'm not finished yet." Marcus was a broken man, and I was just getting started. His mistress had vanished without a trace. His bank accounts were empty. His business was crumbling. His reputation was in tatters. He was losing everything, and yet, he still hadn't felt true pain. Not yet. I wanted him to feel it. I wanted him to drown in the same humiliation, the same agony, the same gut-wrenching despair he had put me through. And so, I delivered the final blow. I waited for the right moment, when he was at his weakest, when he was desperate. It came one night, just a week after his mistress had left, when he stumbled home drunk, again. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes hollow. He looked at me like he didn't even recognize the woman standing in front of him. "Evelyn," he slurred, collapsing onto the couch. Please, let's talk. I raised an eyebrow, sipping my wine. Talk? About what? He leaned forward, running a shaky hand through his disheveled hair. Us. I let out a soft, amused laugh. Us? I repeated, setting my glass down. Oh, Marcus, there is no us. His hands clenched into fists. I made a mistake, okay? He swallowed hard, his voice cracking. I was stupid. I didn't know what I was doing. I tilted my head. Didn't know what you were doing? I repeated, my tone dripping with mock sympathy. Oh, darling, you knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't think you'd get caught. He flinched. I stood up, walking toward him slowly, my heels clicking against the floor. Tell me, Marcus, I murmured, leaning down slightly. Did she make you feel young again? He didn't answer. I smirked, straightening up. She left you the moment the money dried up, didn't she? How predictable. His head dropped into his hands, his entire body trembling. I lost everything, he whispered. I took a deep, satisfied breath. Good, but I wasn't done. You know, I mused, circling around him like a predator. You still have one thing left. His head snapped up, eyes filled with the smallest flicker of hope. What? I smiled sweetly. Me? His brows furrowed in confusion, his tired brain struggling to process my words. I ran a finger down his jaw, making sure he felt my touch, making sure he remembered what he had thrown away. You want to fix things, Marcus? I whispered. You want me back? His breathing hitched, his lips parting slightly. Evelyn, I stepped back suddenly, laughing softly. Too bad. The hope in his eyes shattered instantly. I turned away from him, my smile growing wider as I grabbed my purse. Oh, and one more thing, I said, pausing by the door. He looked up at me, his expression wary. You should probably start looking for a new place to live, I continued, slipping on my coat. I sold the house. His face drained of all color. What? I pulled a set of papers from my bag and tossed them onto the coffee table. Signed, sealed, done. His hands shook as he picked them up, his eyes scanning the words frantically. He flipped through the pages, his fingers tightening around the edges. You can't. I can, I interrupted smoothly. And I did. He shot up from the couch, pure panic in his expression. Evelyn, this is my house. Was? I corrected with a smirk. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his hands trembling. You're kicking me out? I gave him a slow, cruel smile. You kicked me out of your life the moment you started screwing your little toy. Consider this, a fair trade. His entire body sagged, his fingers loosening, the papers slipping from his grip and floating to the floor. Defeated, ruined, utterly destroyed. I turned toward the door, gripping the handle, and then, at the last second, I glanced back over my shoulder. Oh, and Marcus? He barely lifted his head. Have a nice life. And with that, I walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because I knew exactly what I had left behind. A broken man, a ruined man, a man who had spent his nights chasing a fantasy, only to wake up in a nightmare. And I was finally free.